There we go.
Thank you. Welcome everybody to the inaugural lecture of the Kath White Memorial Lecture, and we have a great speaker and a friend of Kath's to mark the occasion. So we're delighted to welcome Glyn. For those of you that don't know, Kath sadly passed away last month, so we're dedicating this lecture to her. She was such an enthusiastic, knowledgeable geographer who organised most of the programme of these lectures and had done for years. She's left an amazing legacy in the North East. Generations of students at Northumbria University have experienced her teaching. Sixth formers and teachers from the school have been inspired by these talks. Personally, I run a PGCE course in teacher training, and I still have students who've been taught by Kath coming through, telling me that she was one of the inspirations for them to take this profession on board. So her legacy will live on for generations and generations to come. So it's a great privilege to make this the Kath White Lecture. Just to kind of point out that was recognised by both the GA and the RGS this year, and we're all very, very proud of her for her sustained contributions. I mean, that says it all. Okay, so I'm going to pass over to Glyn, who's going to share his initial slide, and then I'm going to introduce Glyn. So Glyn, do you want to take over and share your opening slide, please?
Right, let's just fire up. You can master the technology. There we go.
Okay.
Oh, hang on, I just shot past Kath's pic. I'll just you've introduced Kath, so I'm not going to do that again, but I wanted to show this picture because this is Kath on a geography field trip with a bunch of geographers, ex-colleagues from Liverpool University, where she did her geography degree. And she used to organise the reunions every year. And she was a natural born organiser and a lovely personality, as you can see from this photograph. And she's been really much missed by everybody from her university course. I'm just introduce myself briefly. I'm retired now, but was formerly a planner for many years. And in my last position, I was an infrastructure planning commissioner appointed by Secretary of State and an examining inspector. And I'll explain what that means later on. But basically, I'm a grey-haired planner, if you can think of it that way. And I spent a lot of time working in my latter years on infrastructure, large-scale infrastructure, one sort or another. So
just before you start, Glyn, can I make a little plea for everybody to actually turn off their cameras and their microphones during the lecture, because it reduces the bandwidth, which means that the recordings and everything go a bit more smoothly, but it also reduces our carbon footprint, which I would is quite an apt thing to do given the talk we're about to have from Glyn. So thank you very much. If you can turn cameras and microphones off until the questions at the end. Thank you very much.
I've just noticed that we've got 4 people in the waiting room. I'll just let them in before I start, if I can. I think everybody.
Okay, I think we're ready to go then, Glyn. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, the theme of the talk is keeping the lights on in the 21st century, but I want to interpret that fairly broadly and deal with the interface between climate change and energy and what's going on in terms of energy policy and generally what's happening in terms of energy supply. And that's a fairly topical issue at the moment. There are lots of issues and arguments about the future. and we ought to touch on what the government's doing about them and how all this affects the people listening and all of us really, and how we get a say on energy policy and major new projects. So, just some baseline information. Climate change is driving energy policy. UK sea level is rising at 3 millimetres per annum, and by the end of the century, looking at roughly up to just over a metre in sea level rise, with bigger storm surges and waves on top of that. And that issue will get worse. The sea level will keep rising for several centuries. So by 2300, the IPCC will be anticipating a 5 metres rise in sea level, plus the storm surge and waves on top of that. So really you're looking at the impact of marine erosion as being probably around about 10 to 12 metres in level. So that's going to have huge impacts on coastal towns and cities, low-lying areas, and will generate population movements. Parts of the UK will be underwater, especially in eastern England, and we need to head for zero carbon worldwide by 2050 to keep climate warming to 2 degrees. The target agreed in Paris was 1.5 if possible. The rules that the UK must follow are set in international agreements, and the energy network in the UK accounts for all over 2/3 of the UK's emissions. And just to, sorry, the last point on that slide, emissions need to come down each year by a similar proportion, as we saw in the pandemic year last year. But that needs to be year on year over a period of decades. So it gives you some idea of the scale of the task. Climate change policy and legislation, really, Ed Miliband, the rather luckless Labour leader, was Gordon Brown's Energy Secretary of State in 2008. He introduced the Climate Change Act that required an 80% drop in emissions from 1990 through to 2050. The current UK government is now reviewing those targets, and they will be raised. But up to 2019, the UK emissions were 40% lower than 1990, so there's been some progress. And in the short term, we're on track to meet initial targets to 2023. However, the government is failing in its progress towards longer-term reductions, and I'll touch on that later. Power generation is thus far making reasonable progress, but we're not seeing that equivalent progress to date on transport, industry, agriculture, and heating of buildings, where the emissions are still primarily carbon generating. So nearly all of government's policies and programs will need review in order to address this. And there will need to be big private and public investments in infrastructure on top of the large-scale investment that there has been in recent years. Following the election of the current Conservative government, progress initially slowed or stalled. But in the run-in to COP26, which the UK government is going to chair, the Conference of Partners, which is due to take place in Glasgow in a few weeks' time, there is a detectable new momentum. The UK's energy supply position, well, just this slide summarises that. By 2050, most of the energy in industry and transport has to be electrified, but fossil fuels still provided nearly 80% of UK energy in 2019, including 95% of transport fuels. About 25% of the capacity in 2015 had gone by 2020 because a lot of it was coal-powered and elements of oil as well. Not all of that has gone, but the great majority of it has gone. The government flirted with fracking for gas, but carbon emissions were obviously a huge issue with that, and there has been enormous opposition, including within the ranks of the Tory party and other political parties. Electricity and gas demands are inherently peaky, and unfortunately we have limited capacity for storage. And overall, the demand has slightly dipped, including around the pandemic, but will rise again sharply. So we need a lot more capacity to deal with those demand peaks, or we need to find ways of smoothing those peaks through storage, through managing demand by pricing and so on. There's been an enormous growth in renewables, which are by their very nature variable because they're weather dependent. And that growth has in particular taken place in offshore wind. The generation peaks that these renewable sources generate are often mismatched against the demand peaks. So you will need, or we will need, more generating capacity than demand would suggest. So electricity demand will double by 2050. Therefore, low carbon generation capacity must increase by a factor of 4. All UK governments and politicians want a mix of sources. That's renewables, nuclear, different types of nuclear, waste from energy, and everybody wishes to minimise fossil fuels. But the pace and the mix of those sources is still a matter for debate. And there are lots of reasons for that. There's been lots of lobbying from businesses and unions, from campaigners. Party politics plays a part in it, in terms of the ideologies of the different parties. And there's a tension between the objectives of devolved governments versus the UK government, because there's a split of responsibility over energy. UK government is responsible for all energy policy in England, but in Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, the devolved governments have responsibility over generation of any projects less than 300 megawatts, if I remember rightly, which obviously is the majority of the generation capacity. But there are some huge generators which UK government will still control, including nuclear power. There are rapidly changing technologies and prices, and who votes and who pays is a major factor in decision making. However, despite that, and I'll go through a little bit of the recent history of how policies are shifting, some of the differences appear to be reducing, and consensus is growing gradually, and that's partly due to market trends, scientific advice, and the advent or the imminence now of the COP26 conference. So let's just probe that a bit. Look at the party manifestos. Now, obviously, the last general election was in 2017, and this is what the parties said. First of all, the Conservatives made their policy platform very short-term indeed. So their focus was driven by reducing costs. They wanted an independent review of the cost of energy, lower energy prices and subsidy reductions. They wanted security of supply, and I think that's a shared objective with the other parties. Support for energy efficiency, particularly in large businesses. No English onshore wind farms, no new wind farms, because of the lobby from the shires. Strong emphasis on cheap shale gas, interestingly. And they wanted to cut carbon as cheaply as possible to meet climate change commitments. And their principal target was very short term, 15% emissions reduction by 2020. And the gentleman in charge at that point was Greg Clark MP. Interestingly enough, the energy ministers have changed roughly once every year, virtually like changing your socks. Although in fact I change my socks every day. In 2017, the Labour Party's manifesto was agreed the principles with the principles expanded by the Conservatives: security of supply, affordable energy, meeting climate targets. But their proposal is quite different in many ways. They wanted a large-scale investment in renewables and low carbon gas, a ban on fracking, safeguard. They did want to safeguard North Sea oil and gas. Interestingly, at that point, they supported new nuclear projects. They wanted investment in carbon capture and storage, tariff-free energy trading with the EU, because this is pre-Brexit, obviously, and insulation of 4 million homes, and the taking regional power into public hands. Obviously not something you'd see in the Tory manifesto. The SNP were elected the year before. They wanted their whole thrust is around substitution for North Sea oil and gas. Ultimately, they see an independent Scotland as gaining revenue from energy. So, and in fact, Scotland has huge reserves of energy generating potential other than oil and gas, as we'll come on to. They proposed a new Climate Change Act for Scotland. They were targeting 50% emissions reduction by 2020. And they wanted demand reduction and energy efficiency. That's the emissions reduction. Is a lot of it's related to oil, gas, coal, and so on. They wanted 50% of all energy to be from renewables by 2030. That includes gas as well as electricity. They wanted low carbon transition in transport and heat use, and were supporting new wave energy, solar PV, biomass, and so on. They didn't want any new nuclear projects in Scotland. They've got a leaky nuclear power station up there at the moment, or it has been leaky in the past. And they were also targeting low carbon transport. So that's where they started with their party manifestos. And obviously there have been developments since, and things have been changing. First of all, the UK government has produced draft national energy policies, and they're out now for consultation. The SNP and Labour were to some extent ahead of the game. The Conservatives originally were very short-term in their perspective. The Tories and Labour are now, in terms of their public pronouncements, less focused on cheap gas, although in reality there will still be a dependence on gas, certainly up to 2030 and beyond. The Tories have moved their position from fracking to renewables, and that's a lot to do with the reduction in the cost of renewables, which I'll come on to in a minute. Labour were prescient to some extent in their focus on insulation and carbon capture and storage. Climate Rebellion and Insulate Britain are two lobbies, two campaigns, two green campaigns, which are now impacting on party agendas. And you've seen that already in last week's Labour conference pledge for 28 billion per annum net zero programme of investment. We will hear something of that from the Conservatives and no doubt from the SNP. We're awaiting the UK government's, the Treasury's net zero strategy, and hopefully that will emerge before COP26, but it's taken an awful long time to emerge. There's been a lot of debate and deliberation behind the scenes on that. I think one of the issues is that the base load of energy to offset these very peaky renewable energy sources Nuclear is one obvious potential source. The costs of developing that have proved to be very high. It's complex, and nuclear waste is still an issue in terms of the disposal of that. Energy storage is also expensive, and the opportunities and the capacity for nuclear storage at the moment are quite limited. But we do have these ladies and gentlemen gluing themselves to motorways to remind us that this is an important issue. There's been a lot of technical change in a short period of time. The key renewable infrastructure generating sources, the costs of those are falling sharply. Onshore wind is now very low subsidy or self-financing technology. Solar PV and offshore, which is photovoltaics, the solar panels you see on roofs and so on, and the large farms that are now being developed in certain places. Those panels and the offshore wind technologies are getting much cheaper, very quickly. And in fact, in relation to offshore wind, we're now starting to see the development of floating wind farm technology. So wind farms can be placed in much deeper water where there are higher winds, and that has an impact on generating the amount of energy that's generated, how reliable that wind is, how cheap it is to develop these wind farms and so on. The nuclear technology costs are uncertain, very difficult to project on some of these large complex projects, and if anything, those costs are growing. That's prompting a move towards modular reactors of different types, so in an attempt to make the costs more predictable and hopefully reduce the costs if they're on a production line. Coal obviously has largely been phased out, although in fact, as I've noted there is still a planning proposal in front of a planning inspector in relation to a proposed mine in Cumbria, very controversial one, and the examination of that proposal will be continuing towards the end of this month. So it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. Most gas power stations will need carbon capture and storage to remove carbon. Shale gas, as mentioned, has been overtaken by protests and renewables. There are huge challenges in relation to the development of the electricity and gas grids and the updating of those grids. That's partly because the national grid has been focused on large power stations, coal and nuclear, and therefore the grid has been relatively simple. When large numbers of wind farms are developed around the coastline or even on land, each one of those has to be connected to the grid by a power line of one sort or another, either overground or underground. And there are large substations that have to be developed as well. So there are environmental impacts that go with the development of wind farms, and the more wind farms are developed, if each one of those has to be connected to the grid by a separate line, then clearly we could soon see many parts of the country being covered by overhead lines, or which will impact on amenity. Also, it's not a terribly efficient way of building a grid. So effort is now being put into developing a much more coherent and well-planned grid, and we'll see how that transpires. We're still in early days on that, but there is effort being made to address that, including subsea grid linking various wind farms to simplify the number of connections needed. Most gas power stations will, as going forward, need carbon capture and storage to remove carbon. But the current government is still talking about unabated gas power stations being a source of energy going past 2050. I think that will become very controversial as we move forward. Part of the reason for this is that the position they're taking is, I think, that carbon capture and storage remains very expensive, and there are initiatives being looked at to try and reduce those costs, but we're not there yet. The advent of hydrogen, as well as carbon capture and storage, these are the new technologies. Hydrogen potentially has a big future, but there are lots of uncertainties about that because its manufacture sometimes involved the release of greenhouse gas. Electricity storage and, in some cases, off-grid infrastructure, where people have their own solar panels and wind turbines and so on. Those technologies are also emerging. So this is an exciting time for investors, but a risky time because it's not clear which of these technologies really is going to be the most, the thing that will create the solutions for carbon going forward. And it's most likely that there will be a combination, but the balance between them and the amount of subsidy and the amount of money and the amount of demand, these things are yet in the boiling pot. So it's a risky time, not just for the investors, but for the politicians in terms of deciding which way to jump. So what's the UK government doing? Well, those energy policy statements they first adopted in 2011 are now being reviewed and are out to consultation. They are floating higher targets for carbon capture, for reducing carbon in the atmosphere, the emissions. Talked about the closure of coal and oil power stations. They've stalled their carbon capture pilot projects due to high costs at the moment and are trying to get those costs down. They're promoting nuclear, but actually that's proving to be problematic and expensive. So a number of nuclear power station proposals have fallen by the wayside. Hinkley C is going ahead. I'll touch on that later. Fracking has been parked. The dash for gas hasn't found favour in the end, and cheap renewables have essentially won out in that tension between cheap gas and renewables, and that's largely because of the reduction in their costs. However, liquefied natural gas and gas-powered electricity generating plants are still regarded as helpful in the short and medium term. They generate 50% or thereabouts less greenhouse gas than a coal-powered station, for example. But they're certainly not the answer in the long term. The government's promoting the electrification of transport, the advent of hydrogen, possibly to replace our natural gas supplies for heating in the house, for example, and certainly heat pumps for heating, although they're very expensive. The UK has established links into the new European Union supergrid power network via interconnectors, and new interconnectors have been built to Norway, Belgium and France, despite Brexit. And in terms of the Climate Change Committee's conclusion, the UK government isn't doing enough and much more must be done. Let's have a look at what else is going on. In Scotland, energy consumption is now roughly 25% renewable, and they're aiming for net zero 5 years earlier than the rest of the UK by 2045. Their emphasis is very much on a just transition, in inverted commas, switching jobs from oil and gas to green employment. And ideally, the SNP want an independent Scotland to tax energy exports, replacing income that otherwise would have come from oil and gas. So they have the idea of their wind farms generating surplus energy, surplus electricity, and exporting that electricity over the border and taxing it as it goes to generate money that will support Scotland's public sector. They are against new nuclear, and 95% of their electricity is now renewable, so they're making progress. The Welsh Government owns most of its onshore wind farm sites. They're mainly forests owned by the public sector. They claim to have achieved 50% of Wales' electricity consumption from renewables in 2018, and they're looking to achieve 70% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. Welsh Government prefers renewables, no doubt partly because of its vested interest, but it's also got a very well-developed set of environment policies. However, they are still supportive of Wilver B nuclear power station proposal, which is currently stalled because its Japanese backers have pulled out. Westminster has shifted its position, so it moved away from fracking. It's proposing in the run-in to COP26, they're proposing targets for energy reduction, emission reduction of 78% by 2035, net zero by 2050. And they sort of developed their range of their thinking a little bit. I think they're looking to offshore wind, including floating wind, solar, wave tidal, energy from waste with or without carbon capture, biomass with or without carbon capture, and biomass, by biomass I mean any type of vegetation that can generate energy, and some generates more energy than others. Natural gas with or without carbon capture, low carbon hydrogen, large scale nuclear, and the variations on that, small modular reactors, advanced modular reactors, and fusion power plants, all of which the UK does have some expertise in. Now, and interesting enough, the Brexit has led to the removal of, or is leading to the removal of, the European Union's environmental safeguards. So as these projects come forward, it will be important to understand what environmental safeguards the UK is going to introduce to replace those that were embedded as part of our membership of the EU. Excuse me. I'm going to resort to a strepsil. Right. How does all this affect us? Well, clearly there are going to be some very big infrastructure investments and projects coming forward. In the short term, we've got a steep hike in gas and electricity prices. There's going to be a lot of public and private spending on energy, and implicit in that is higher tax and bills in the short to medium term. But longer term, the falls in the prices of energy infrastructure like renewables are likely to lead to relatively lower costs in energy than otherwise we may have faced. We may see more projects near to us, and this term NSIP, you'll see on the slide, means nationally significant infrastructure projects. So we may see nuclear projects, wind projects, solar projects cropping up not too far away, together with the transmission lines, pylons and pipelines necessary to link all those up. We may see off-grid and local energy coming forward, and certainly I've seen some of that in rural areas. And we're going to see obviously a shift from the diesel and petrol vehicles towards electric, and you need to save up to buy the Tesla there on the right. We'll certainly see more radical energy efficient buildings, and the image here on the lower right of the slide shows a house that is fairly self-sufficient. They're expensive to build though, at least at the moment, although like everything else, costs are changing costs are coming down. We'll certainly see the use of smart infrastructure. Smart metering is already widespread across the UK. And we will see stricter reuse and recycling of waste. England is not as far ahead as Wales, for example, in that regard. There's a long way to go. So let's have a look at these NSIPs, or nationally significant infrastructure projects, in a little bit more detail. They are big infrastructure projects important to the economy. The decision as to what is an NSIP and what isn't, the definition of an NSIP, if you like, is set out in legislation in the Planning Act 2008 and in government policies. If a developer wants to bring forward an NSIP, they make an application for permission, and they make that application to the Planning Inspectorate, which is part of government. Councils, other bodies and local people are consulted by the developers before they make the application, and they produce a report. They're required to produce a report saying what the consultation responses were as part of the application. And then a group of people like myself then examine the project application. And that'll be done in writing, but also we will hold hearings, and that's on the right there. I'm involved in a hearing together with a couple of colleagues. We produce a report, and those reports would go off to the Secretary of State, and the decision would be made by the Secretary of State after considering the examiner's report. Now, you've got a chance in all of that process to put your views across, both at an early stage, to comment, to object, or to support an application, and you subsequently have the opportunity to participate in an examination, if you wish to. Right, a few examples of these things. Hinkley Point C nuclear power station, huge project on the Severn Estuary near Bristol. It's an extension to an existing nuclear power station brought forward by EDF, which is essentially the French government, the power arm of the French government, and a Chinese consortium. Very complex, very expensive, an untested design. So, you know, they've had to go through all the safety procedures with the Nuclear Inspectorate. It's taking 10 years to build, but when it is built, it'll have a very large power output, and the energy will potentially be enough to satisfy the needs for 6 million homes. An £18 billion investment at the last count. 37 billion lifetime cost. So you can see these figures are astronomical. Next project is one I worked on. In fact, that image, the previous couple of slides, was we were examining, holding a hearing into this particular project. Developer is E.ON, part financed by the Green Investment Bank. The capacity is 400 megawatts, sufficient to serve 300,000 homes. So it's 8 times smaller than Hinkley, but a 14th of the cost. So basically a cheaper way of producing energy. However, the underground cables cross the South Downs National Park to a large inland substation of 90 acres. So there was an environmental impact to consider there. And the 28 square miles of this wind farm off Brighton, 8 to 16 miles off Brighton, is visible from Brighton seafront. It's also visible from the South Downs National Park, so those aspects have to be considered carefully. Another one I dealt with, Brigacum Waste to Energy Plant. This is a huge building. It doesn't really give you, I mean, that slide, it could be the size of a small hut, but in reality, it's larger than the Millennium Stadium in Cardiff as a proposal. Project cost 400 million. the energy was intended to that it was intended to generate would have provided electricity for 180,000 homes. Visual impact on the Brecon Beacons National Park was perched on top of a hill above Merthyr Tydfil, and there were over 10,000 written objections, principally to the air pollution generated from the top of the very tall chimney in burning the 750,000 tons of waste that it was intended to deal with. But it ran into huge problems, and the application was ultimately withdrawn, and we awarded costs against the developer, against the applicant. So not all of these things get through the process. I referred to gas stations. They're still being built. This one is similar to a new one that was built in Wrexham and is now in operation. It was opened, I think, a year ago, or maybe two. 300 megawatt station. So there's still a lot of these being built without carbon capture. The government policies that I'm talking about, the energy policies, you're able to comment on these if you wish to. They're out for consultation, the closing date being 29th of November. And you can go on the UK government website and get hold of these policies and have a look through them. And there is a consultation form there where you can respond to various questions put by the government as part of its structuring of the consultation. There's an overarching national energy policy, and then 4 technology-specific policies, one for natural gas, electricity generating infrastructure like the slide previous to this, one for renewables, one for gas supply and infrastructure and gas and oil pipelines, and one for electricity networks infrastructure, which are the overground cables and underground lines. So if you ended up being concerned about a project or wish to support a project that was proposed nearby, or anywhere in the country for that matter, how would you go about it? Well, first of all, you need to understand the planning process, which is not straightforward. It's quite complicated. There is a national infrastructure website, and on that website there are a whole series of advice notes. There are advice notes for the developers, but there are also advice notes for how to get involved in the planning process. And I wrote that advice note, as it turns out. It's probably been updated since I left the inspectorate, but the basics I think are still there. I think it's very important to listen to the developer's explanation of what they're trying to do before the application, and to participate in their pre-application consultation process. Make your comments there, because it becomes very helpful later on. And it's very also important to comment to and lobby the other people who may be involved, the council, the Environment Agency, any other body who may be actively engaged with the project. And if you wish to go the whole hog, as it were, and register as an interested party to the examination, you then register effectively to become part of a legal process. It's not on. It's similar to appearing in court, so you need to understand it's quite a serious commitment. You can get together with other people to present a case, maybe as part of a group, a protest group, or a set of supporters even. We did have quite a lot of organised support to the wind farm off Brighton, which is quite a green city, as you're aware. Evidence has to be submitted in support of whatever you say. So there's no point in just saying, I don't like this. You have to say, what's wrong with it? Why don't you like it? What are the reasons? What evidence you have to support your position? And you could be, if you go down that road, you need to be prepared for an exhaustive process. So the inspectors who are examining will investigate the points that are being made. So you may be asked questions about the evidence behind what you're saying. And of course, if you're part of an organisation or if you've got a lot of money, deep pockets, you can ask a specialist to help you. There are plenty of consultants out there who will be pleased to help at a price. So that's the end of our presentation. But what do you think? Are you an activist in the climate field? Do you have a view on energy policy? Should anything be done, anything else be done to save the planet's climate? And I think at that point I'll hand back to you and see what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Glyn. That was a great talk. I've been furiously scribbling notes because I can see this your talk lending itself brilliantly to decision-making exercises for A-level students when they have to look at all the different stakeholders in large-scale projects, which is something that we would do at GCSE and A-level. So, you know, from the teaching point of view, it's a very useful summary of all the kind of big issues going on around these sort of large infrastructure projects that we might see popping up all around us as we move from fossil fuels. Has anybody got any questions for Glyn? If you'd like to unmute and ask a question, I would be very delighted to answer them.
Hello, Glyn. My name is Tony North. I was wondering about the difference in the nuclear project at Hinkley Point. How much electricity is costing compared with, say, wind power or new wind site? Is that?
I haven't got that figure immediately to hand, but I do know that it is very expensive relatively. But obviously it depends on the life of the project. There is a huge amount of embedded energy in the construction of a nuclear station. And the capital costs of building these things is absolutely enormous by comparison with, for example, the Rampion wind farm. So I think the example I gave there was that the Rampion wind farm was around about 1/14 of the cost. And so you can, and 1/8 of it generates 1/8 of the energy. So as you can see, the actual relative value for money of renewables is higher, but the energy that's generated is peakier. So they aren't direct substitutes one for the other, and the government essentially is willing to pay a higher intervention rate to subsidize the energy generated from nuclear because it produces constant energy. It has a fairly level output of energy, whereas the offshore wind farms still can experience slumps in wind generation depending on the weather, and those can last for days and weeks. So a key problem is long-term storage or nuclear, and there is an extent to which storage can be an alternative to nuclear, but the problem with that is the capacity of the geography of the UK to accommodate things like pump storage schemes, which is where a lake is used to usually two lakes, a lower lake from which water is pumped up to a higher lake during the off-peak periods and then allowed to fall to generate electricity through a turbine to supplement when you've got a slump in energy generation from other sources. There is one of those in Snowdonia, for example, but there are others as well in Scotland. And the problem with it is the geography of the UK has opportunities for those, but not enough, and not of large enough scale to offset and provide the type of support that might come from a nuclear station. So nuclear has its place at the moment in the energy mix for the UK going forward.
Okay. What about hydrogen? Isn't hydrogen storage, wouldn't it be sensible to use excess electricity to create hydrogen, which could then be converted back to electricity relatively easily?
Well, again, it comes back to cost. Hydrogen technologies are emerging technologies at the moment. There are, in America, I think there are operational stations using hydrogen, but they're still relatively small scale. So the technology for hydrogen has to be scaled up, and the costs have to be brought under control. I live in South Cheshire, and some of the experiments are here down at Keele. Keele University is working on how the national gas grid might be adapted to take hydrogen. And there are technological experiments going on the best mechanism for hydrogen, for producing hydrogen. You've got to create hydrogen through a process, and that process can be done through using gas-generated electricity, or it can be done through a greener process using carbon capture. I think there are about 3 different technologies that can be used to create hydrogen before you then pump it into a gas grid. But it's obviously a lot lighter than natural gas, and it's highly inflammable, as you'll remember from the R101. So putting it into the domestic grid, the different levels of doing it. You can put 10% hydrogen into the gas mix and pump that through the existing grid. And there are, that's I think one of the things that Keele is working on at the moment. They I think are looking at the possibility of what changes are needed technologically to get that percentage up to 20%. And obviously, in doing that, you are reducing the amount of greenhouse gas emission potentially. So all of this is good stuff, but it's costly. Developing the technology is difficult and problematic, and there are risks associated with it. It's still uncertain as to whether it can be rolled out at the scale needed. So it's got potential, and it's also got potential, by the way, not just for domestic and industrial heating, but also for transport. There are cars running around London which are hydrogen powered, and in fact California has quite a well-developed network of hydrogen stations, apparently. But those technologies are still emerging in transport and have a way to go. You could see perhaps hydrogen being used in buses and lorries rather than cars, but we don't know. At this stage, it's still a big question mark. Transport could look quite different in 10 years' time, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, some great questions there, Anthony. Thank you very much. Anybody else got a question for Glyn?
Oh man, do you see responsibility for energy security being decentralized, i.e. to local communities, for example, in terms of local energy storage or something similar?
Well, I think it's more likely in the devolved administrations rather than with the UK government at the moment. Some of the devolved, I think in Scotland and in Wales, there have been initiatives to develop things like hydro at a local level. And in fact, we've got a hydro project here, community-based hydro, running from the River Dane, which has just opened. So yeah, there are some experiments at a relatively small level, but by comparison, say with Denmark, where communities have been supported by the Danish government to bring forward community-based energy generation, mainly from wind, but different projects. And in fact, they've got district heating as well there. So local government has played an important role in the development of energy in Denmark. You don't see that here at the moment. There are still initiatives taken by some local authorities to bring forward district heating, and I can see some of those being supported by the UK government, but it's still very half-hearted. I think they're small scale compared to what's happened in Denmark and to a lesser extent in Germany. Now that's partly down to our constitution. You know, we have a very centralized state here. Germany has a much more devolved form of administration, and so does Denmark. And the mayors, local mayors and local councils have far more discretion and initiative over their energy supplies, as we used to have here in the 19th century. You know, Birmingham and Manchester developed, and in fact most towns up until about before the First World War had their own town gas schemes, and those were developed with private companies and corporations set up by local authorities. But all of that changed as the country became much more centralized, and energy infrastructure and the administration and governance of it became much more centralized, generally in big corporations.
I guess I suppose if we start seeing dynamically changing hourly fuel tariffs being taken to the domestic market as it is on the national market, then that might encourage home investment in storage technologies or using your EV battery to ride through the peak, etc.
Oh yes, I think that is possible. I think that's the only thing is, and I've looked into this personally to see if, you know, how much it would cost, and you are looking at, you know, well upwards of £10,000 to get a good battery installed in your garage or whatever, to run your electric vehicle and then generate some additional electricity into the grid to offset some of the costs. You know, and especially when you're linking it with solar panels on the roof and so on, you could spend, you know, on a detached house maybe £15,000-20,000 on solar panels alone, never mind the battery and the converter, the inverter, and the things that you need. So it's still a relatively pricey thing to do. And you know how long those technologies last. I mean, when you're doing those things yourselves, you've got to maintain that kit, and then you need to replace it when it gets old. None of that applies when you're just plugging into a nuclear power station, as it were. So it'll be interesting to see how it pans out. I think you're going to have such an interesting few years with all of this. Could be an expensive few years as well. But you know, I think our kids and grandchildren will be seeing big changes, and you know that they will look back at our what we were doing and say, what a waste, you know, how wasteful we were.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Glyn. Yes, I hope things change rapidly. You know, I'm a big believer in the geographies of hope, and you know, things have to get better. So you've given us some real food for thought there about kind of how we approach these issues of decarbonising our electricity supply. Yes, thank you very much. Is there anything else anybody wants to ask, or anything else you want to add, Glyn?
I think I'd just like to, given that this is the Kath White Memorial Lecture, I'd just like to wind up by saying how much we appreciated Kath's contribution in the Liverpool University group that she was very supportive of, and how much we appreciated her as a friend. And I really welcome the opportunity to give the lecture in her name. That's really helpful.
And I think you've done a masterclass in how to give a good lecture for the branch, and a very worthy lecture for the first inaugural Cath White lecture. So thank you very, very much on behalf of the branch, and for all the students and teachers and interested parties who will be watching in the next weeks and months to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. Would you mind pausing the recording, stopping the recording now? That would be great. Thank you.
I can do that.